On September 1st, 2016, Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral ceased to exist as a functional facility. The explosion was visible from Orlando, 45 miles away. The fireball consumed a Falcon 9 rocket, its amos 6 satellite payload worth an estimated $285 million, and nearly ended SpaceX as a viable company. What most people remember is the spectacular footage of the explosion. What they do not remember, because it was never widely reported, is that SpaceX was already burning through cash to fund rapid scaling, already behind schedule and already facing questions from NASA, the Air Force, and every insurance underwriter in the aerospace industry about whether Elon Musk's approach to spaceflight was fundamentally unsafe. The Amos 6 failure was not SpaceX's first disaster. It was not even their most expensive, but it was the one that forced a reckoning with a question the company had been avoiding since its founding. Can you really innovate your way to reliability? Or does aerospace require the slow, methodical, conservative approach that defined the industry for 60 years? To understand why this moment mattered, we need to go back to 2002, when SpaceX was founded with a budget that traditional aerospace companies would have considered inadequate to design a single-engine component. Musk's initial plan was straightforward to the point of naivete. Build a small rocket, launch it cheaply, undercut the competition, scale up. The Falcon one would cost $6 million per launch. It would fly within 2 years. It would be profitable by year 3. None of that happened. The Falcon 1's first launch attempt in 2006 ended 33 seconds after liftoff when a fuel line leak caused a fire that destroyed the first stage. The second attempt in 2007 made it to stage separation before a roll control malfunction sent the second stage tumbling. The third attempt in 2008 reached space but failed to achieve orbit due to a timing error during stage separation. Each failure cost between $10 and $15 million. Each failure pushed SpaceX closer to bankruptcy. By August 2008, the company had one rocket left, no money for another, and a workforce that had not been paid in weeks. The fourth Falcon 1 launch succeeded. Barely. It reached orbit with 90 kilograms of payload, proving the concept but not the business model. 2 months later, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract for cargo resupply to the International Space Station. That contract saved the company. It also locked SpaceX into a development timeline and reliability standard they were not prepared to meet. The transition from Falcon 1 to Falcon 9 was not an incremental improvement. It was a complete redesign at a scale SpaceX had never attempted. 9 Merlin engines instead of 1, 10 times the thrust, a payload capacity of 10,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, and a requirement implicit in the NASA contract that this vehicle would eventually carry humans. The first Falcon 9 launched in June 2010. It worked. The second launch in December 2010 carried a Dragon capsule to orbit and returned it safely. SpaceX had gone from a company that could barely reach orbit to one delivering cargo to the ISS in less than 3 years. But speed has consequences. On October 7, 2012, during the first operational cargo mission to the ISS, one of the Falcon 9's 9 engines experienced a catastrophic failure 79 seconds into flight. The engine exploded. Debris damaged the engine next to it. The rocket's flight computer shut down both engines and compensated by burning the remaining 7 longer. The primary payload reached orbit. A secondary payload did not. SpaceX called it a success because the Dragon capsule completed its mission, and the FAA grounded Falcon 9 for 4 months while investigating whether the failure mode posed a risk to public safety. This became the pattern. Rapid iteration, occasional failure, quick investigation, return to flight. In June 2015, a Falcon 9 carrying cargo to the ISS disintegrated 139 seconds after launch. The cause was a failed strut in the second stage liquid oxygen tank. The strut was rated for 10,000 pounds of force. It failed at 2,000 pounds. SpaceX had been using an industrial-grade strut from a supplier without conducting independent verification testing on every unit, trusting the certification data at face value. That assumption cost them a rocket, a Dragon capsule, and roughly $110 million in hardware and payload. The failure also revealed something more troubling. SpaceX's quality control processes were not keeping pace with their launch cadence. The company was flying rockets every few weeks, faster than any competitor, but they were doing it by accepting risks that traditional aerospace companies would never tolerate. They were testing in production. They were finding flaws during flight operations that should have been caught during ground testing. And they were learning lessons at $50 million per incident. Then came Amos 6. The explosion happened during a routine pre-launch static fire test, not even during flight. The rocket was fully fueled, sitting on the pad, firing its engines for a few seconds to verify performance before the scheduled launch 2 days later. At T-3 minutes, while the rocket was being loaded with liquid oxygen, sensors detected a pressure anomaly in the second stage. 0.8 of a second later, the second stage exploded. 3 seconds after that, the first stage exploded. The entire vehicle was destroyed in less than 5 seconds. The investigation took 4 months. SpaceX engineers reviewed 3,000 channels of telemetry data, analyzed debris, conducted tests on identical hardware, and eventually narrowed the failure to a single component: a composite overwrapped pressure vessel, or COPV, inside the liquid oxygen tank. These vessels store helium at 5,500 pounds per square inch to pressurize the propellant tanks. They are made of aluminum liners wrapped in carbon fiber composite. They are submerged in liquid oxygen at -297 degrees Fahrenheit. And under certain conditions, liquid oxygen can become trapped between the liner and the composite wrap, creating pockets of solid oxygen that can ignite from friction or impact. This was not a known failure mode. It had never occurred in ground testing. It had never occurred during flight. It occurred because SpaceX was loading propellants faster and colder than anyone had done before, creating thermal and pressure conditions that revealed a flaw no one knew existed. The failure was so obscure, so dependent on precise timing and temperature, that SpaceX could not reliably reproduce it, even after they understood the mechanism. The cost of Amos 6 extended far beyond the hardware. SpaceX had 70 launches on their manifest worth over $10 billion. Every customer was now questioning whether their payload would be next. Insurance rates for SpaceX launches doubled. NASA delayed crew certification. The Air Force, which had just certified Falcon 9 for national security missions, began reconsidering whether SpaceX met their reliability standards. And Launch Complex 40 was so badly damaged that it would take over a year to rebuild. But here is where the story diverges from every other aerospace disaster in history. SpaceX did not respond by slowing down. They did not add layers of bureaucracy. They did not retreat to a conservative, risk-averse posture. Instead, they did something that traditional aerospace companies would consider insane. They accelerated. Within weeks of the Amos 6 failure, SpaceX engineers were redesigning the COPV system, modifying loading procedures, and planning return to flight. They shifted launches from Complex 40 to Complex 39A, on the historic Apollo and shuttle pad that SpaceX had been refurbishing. They implemented new inspection protocols. They changed the way they loaded propellants, warming the liquid oxygen slightly to avoid the conditions that caused the failure. And on January 14, 2017, just 135 days after the explosion, they launched again. More importantly, they began treating every failure not as something to be avoided, but as data to be exploited. The Amos 6 investigation had revealed that their COPV design had a failure mode no one anticipated. Fine, they would redesign the COPV, but they would also redesign their entire approach to testing and validation. Instead of relying on supplier certifications, they would test every critical component themselves. Instead of assuming that ground testing could predict flight behavior, they would instrument their vehicles to capture data that would reveal problems before they became catastrophic. This is where SpaceX's strategy diverged fundamentally from traditional aerospace. Companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin achieve reliability through exhaustive analysis and testing before flight. They build margins into every system. They design for worst-case scenarios. They move slowly because the cost of failure is unacceptable. SpaceX achieves reliability through iteration. They accept that early failures are inevitable. They design systems to fail safely when possible and to provide diagnostic data when they fail catastrophically. They move fast because the cost of delay is greater than the cost of failure. The numbers support this approach. Between 2010 and 2016, SpaceX flew roughly 29 Falcon 9 missions. 2 failed completely. 1 suffered a partial failure, including the Amos 6 pad explosion. The full mission success rate sat around 75 to 80%, which would be unacceptable for a mature launch system, but is not unusual for a new vehicle in its first 6 years of operation. Between 2017 and 2023, after implementing the lessons from Amos 6, SpaceX flew over 200 Falcon 9 missions with only 1 partial failure. The success rate improved to over 99%. More importantly, the cost per launch dropped from $62 million to under $30 million for reused boosters, making Falcon 9 the cheapest and most reliable orbital rocket in operation. But the real breakthrough was not technical. It was cultural. SpaceX had created an organization that treated failure as a resource rather than a catastrophe. When a Starship prototype exploded during a pressure test in 2019, engineers were reviewing telemetry data within hours and building the next prototype within days. When SN8 crashed during its first high-altitude flight test in December 2020, Musk tweeted congratulations to the team for the successful ascent and descent, treating the landing failure as a minor issue to be resolved. When SN9, SN10, and SN11 all crashed or exploded in early 2021, SpaceX kept building and flying, incorporating lessons from each failure into the next vehicle. This approach is only possible because SpaceX owns the entire development and production process. They do not rely on subcontractors for critical components. They do not answer to shareholders demanding quarterly profits. They do not operate under cost-plus contracts that reward slow, conservative engineering. They build rockets in-house, test them aggressively, fly them frequently, and iterate based on real operational data. The financial model accepts that some vehicles will be lost. The engineering model assumes that failures will reveal problems that analysis cannot predict. The organizational model empowers engineers to make rapid decisions without waiting for approval from layers of management. Traditional aerospace companies cannot operate this way. Boeing's Starliner program has spent over $5 billion in 7 years trying to achieve what SpaceX accomplished with Crew Dragon in half the time and a fraction of the cost. The difference is not that SpaceX engineers are smarter or work harder. The difference is that Boeing's processes, refined over decades of cost-plus contracting and risk-averse management, are optimized to avoid failure rather than to learn from it. Every anomaly triggers reviews, boards, documentation, and delays. Every component requires multiple layers of approval. Every decision is evaluated based on whether it increases or decreases programmatic risk. SpaceX evaluates decisions based on whether they accelerate learning. A test that fails but provides useful data is more valuable than a test that succeeds without revealing anything new. A design that fails in a predictable, well-instrumented way is better than a design that might fail in an unknown mode. A development program that loses 3 prototypes but achieves operational capability in 2 years is preferable to a program that loses no prototypes but takes a decade to fly. This is why the Amos 6 disaster became a strategic advantage rather than a death sentence. It forced SpaceX to confront the limits of their approach and to build systems that could sustain their pace of iteration without accumulating hidden risks. It revealed that their COPV design had a flaw, but it also revealed that their testing and review processes were inadequate. It cost them a rocket and a launch pad, but it taught them how to build better rockets and how to design systems that fail safely. The lesson extends beyond SpaceX. The aerospace industry has spent 60 years optimizing for reliability at the expense of innovation. Launch costs have remained stubbornly high because the cost of failure is so catastrophic that no one is willing to take risks. Development timelines stretch to decades because every decision must be analyzed, are reviewed, and approved by committees that prioritize risk reduction over progress. And as a result, the industry has stagnated. The rockets flying today are only incrementally better than those that flew in the 1980s. The cost to reach orbit has decreased only marginally. The pace of innovation has slowed to a crawl. SpaceX proved that another path is possible, not by being reckless, but by being systematic about learning from failure. Not by ignoring risk, but by accepting that some risks are necessary to achieve breakthrough performance. Not by moving fast and breaking things carelessly, but by moving fast and studying what breaks so that the next iteration is better. The question now is whether this approach can be replicated. So SpaceX succeeded because Musk was willing to risk his entire fortune on an audacious vision, and because the company operated outside the traditional aerospace ecosystem. Most companies do not have that freedom. Most programs cannot tolerate the political and financial consequences of spectacular public failures. Most organizations cannot sustain the cultural commitment to rapid iteration when every failure triggers investigations, lawsuits, and congressional hearings. But the alternative is a future where space access remains expensive, infrequent, and stagnant, where innovation is constrained by the need to avoid failure at all costs, where the next generation of space systems takes 20 years and $50 billion to develop because no one is willing to take the risks necessary to move faster. Amos 6 was a billion-dollar disaster. It was also the moment that proved a different approach to aerospace engineering could work. Whether that approach becomes the new standard or remains an anomaly will determine what space access looks like for the next 50 years. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more stories where history, technology, and human ambition collide. Thanks for watching.